Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories, but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their desert island drugs, a career anthem and joyful patient stories. Welcome, this is the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. Welcome to episode 8, series 2. This week we're joined by Lelly Oboh. Lelly is a consultant pharmacist at Guy's and St Thomas NHS Trust, where she works with a team of pharmacists and pharmacy technicians looking after frail, older people with complex needs. We'll hear from Lelly in a moment as she shares her desert island drug, a career anthem, and recommends a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. Our micro discussion this week will look at Mindlines and how healthcare professionals, in this case, make sense of evidence in practice. But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both. What have you been up to?
Evening.
Evening. Nothing pharmacy from me, just a usual week in work, but I did something interesting on the weekend. I did my first ever escape room. You've ever done one of them? So that was quite good fun. I was up back in the northwest and we went to Wigan and did an escape room in there. I didn't escape from Wigan, unfortunately, but I did escape from the room. It was good. We were on a spaceship. We had to reach the escape pod and we did it with 7 seconds to spare. I'd recommend that for anyone.
Life on the edge.
I know, rock and roll.
Yeah. I also didn't have anything to bring up this time about work because I'm a bit tired this week because I did a big cycle ride at the weekend that I've been training for a while. Did the Dartmoor Classic, which is 110 miles and 10,000 feet of climb. So I was knackered actually on Monday.
That's good going.
Yeah, it was good fun.
Is that your longest, Steve?
It is actually, yeah. The toughest I've done as well.
The car 10, which is Cardiff to Tenby, is 107 miles, so you beat me by 3 miles.
Yeah, it's all about the elevation, I think, not the mileage.
Yeah, I think there is elevation on that, but not that much.
So what about you, James?
I'm probably as tired as you were after your 100 miles because I've just arrived back from the High Court in London. And so I've been giving evidence in the preliminary trial between the NHS ministers and Servia, the pharmaceutical company. Been involved with it for the last 5 years. And so it feels good to have finally given my verbal evidence. Been fascinating to be involved in. Always known that over the last 5 years, that day would come, that gut-wrenching, stomach-turning time would come where myself and a number of NHS colleagues had to go and be cross-examined by the barristers. And so all in all, an amazing CPD experience. The trial continues and we will watch with interest.
Was it full pomp and ceremony, Jamie?
Yes, the High Court, wigs were dispensed with on the first morning, so the judge allows the barristers to remove their wigs, but they had to keep their gown.
Okay, well, the most important question that I'm sure everybody wants to know is, did you tell them about the Oral Apothecary?
I tried to set a few workshops while I was there, but...
We're shameless.
I tell you what, if they had been listening to the Oral Apothecary for the last sort of 15 or 16 episodes or so, that would have filled in a lot of the gaps and the blanks on how the complexity of prescribing and medicines optimisation in particular.
Very good. Yeah, well done to you. First person I know that's had to go to the High Court anyway.
Yeah, no, good stuff, Jamie.
Right. Well, I'd like to warmly welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast Lelly Oboh. And I first met Lelly back in 2007 when we both, I remember, trudging up to the RPS. So I think what was one of the very first meetings of the first 30 or 40 consultants in England at the time. And that was the first time I met Lelly. And she just brings an energy and a pragmatism to everything that she gets involved with. And I think she's truly inspirational. And if anybody's ever heard her speak, they'll know that. And I know you say this a lot, Lelly, don't you? But you came from a community pharmacy background. And then you became, in fact, in 2007, the first pharmacy consultant who'd come from community pharmacy. And now you've gone all the way and you work at Guy's and Thomas's with this team of pharmacists and technicians, but you're very much working with a full team of people, aren't you, across the CCG or the ICS or whatever it's called. Certainly not place, because you know I hate place, but a whole raft of people in relation to your passion, isn't it? Which is about how do you put together frailty, multimorbidity and polypharmacy. And I know that when it comes to clinical leadership, there isn't any group or Royal College or something that you've not been asked to give evidence for. So I think it speaks volumes. So it's an absolute pleasure to invite you onto the Oral Apothecary Podcast.
Wow. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, boys. It's such a great pleasure to be part of this and to have this opportunity to just kind of chat on your podcast. I'm really excited.
Okay, good. So what's the number one thing on your agenda then at the minute, Lelly? What would you say?
Right. So this should not come as a surprise because it's about polypharmacy, frailty, multimorbidity, and actually how do we do patient-centered care? How do we have better conversations, including shared decision making? And how can we see primary care workforce and pharmacists to begin to be more comfortable with working in grey? So I have two main issues. One is the clinical issue, and that's really around how do we raise awareness about the wicked problem of polypharmacy in this group of people. A while ago, when I was dealing with dosette boxes, as we call them, I read something about somebody called Keith Grint, and he talks about a wicked problem. He talks about tame problems and critical problems and a wicked problem. And it talks about 10 things that you would find that should let you know that you're dealing with a wicked problem. And so many of them resonated with me around polypharmacy. So conflicting agendas of people who are involved, never being completely solved. Each problem is unique. There is no right and wrong. It's just to make things better or worse. They're multifactorial. It kind of works through disciplines and organizations. And any solution you come up with almost has an impact on another part of the system. And sometimes the solutions might bring up worse consequences. And so that kind of got me thinking around how we begin to embrace complexity, uncertainty, and risk. So I think one of my biggest problems is trying to, or one of the biggest things I'm tackling is trying to raise awareness. How do we work with the art of conversation and patient relationships? Because this is really key to managing like wicked problems. The second thing is really how do we get people to start to think differently? How can we stop talking about drugs and diseases and start having conversations about patients? And then the other thing on my mind actually is then a leadership problem, which is how do we get people to start to think and to work in this new way? How do we get people who have limited time to understand that building relationships and having decent conversations is just as weighty as having the clinical knowledge? That's a big shift for us as pharmacists.
Yeah. And I know whenever I heard you speak that is exactly what you say, and you're absolutely spot on. If you don't work out what matters to the patient, then everything else is a complete waste of time almost.
The context of people's daily lives is more important.
Yeah.
I think the idea of wicked problems is something that comes up when you're looking at complexity and complex adaptive systems and so on, which is something I'm very interested in and something that we've touched on before. It's really interesting what you describe. I recommend look up things like the Stacey grid, which sort of describes sort of a complex environments versus more controlled environments. And what it says is that the solutions that we often try are actually those solutions, such as guidelines and evidence and meetings and protocols. They're solutions that only work in ordered systems, and where you're working, what you're describing is a very unordered system, and so you need different solutions that are more based on probing and testing and innovation. But the health service doesn't like that, does it?
No. I often get asked with structured medication reviews and managing polypharmacy, can we have a template? And my answer is SOP, typical pharmacist answer. And I say to them, what you need is to think about how do you have conversations about aligning agendas? How do you ask questions that explore and tell you what is really on the heart of the patient? How do you prioritize this issue? So you have an agenda, they have an agenda. How are we going to align both agendas? How are we going to share decisions about what might work? How are we going to have conversations about all the options? And then we have to agree a plan. And then we have to find a way of implementing that plan and just knowing that that plan might change, but we have to keep coming back to it. And the whole process is iterative because there's so many things that are dynamic and moving. A patient could be okay today in their home. Tomorrow they could end up in hospital with a fall, and you might have to look at the drugs all over again. It's kind of a new way of working where pharmacists historically, we just kind of go through a process and you move from A to B and we strictly follow, which is useful in some instances. But when you start working with people, it gets messy.
That's a great way of describing it.
We've done well to avoid sporting references on this podcast to date, but the one that springs to mind here, Lelly, and I'll share it with our listeners, is this notion of play what's in front of you. And so we hear it, we train athletes and sportsmen and women to behave in a certain way, and that's the guidelines, isn't it? But actually, when the reality hits you and the complexity of people's lives, my wife is a palliative care consultant and sees it day in, day out, week in, week out of what happens. And so, play what's in front of you, I think, is particularly relevant there.
The other way I used to describe it in hospitals, and people may have heard me say this before, but the process thing is we'd become like MR monkeys and discharge donkeys, and all the bit in the middle, what I called the ET, the enhanced thinking, had kind of gone out the window, mainly because there wasn't enough time. But you're right in that process takes over, and I find this, like you, when I'm training people, I have to say to them, right, your structured way of doing it, yes, you need to have a plan, you can do that before, but once you get into the real world, like Jamie's saying, once you get into what's in front of you, the patient might completely blow away 9 of the 10 things that you thought that you were going to do, and that's fine, and they find that really hard.
I mean, that is, you've just summarized it, because that's what happens. So we go in and we invite patients. We want to stop their opiates. We want to deprescribe medicines. We want to do all kinds of things. And then the patient comes in and they have constipation. And that's what they want to talk about. You can say what you like about the medicines. They're not listening. And so you almost have to listen to what they're saying. And I think what I find quite interesting is when I go in with, I've looked at all the medicines that are high risk and the opiates. When I go in and I give the patients a minute to talk, I often find things that they want to happen that are also on my agenda. And then you have a win-win, because if somebody's complaining about constipation and they're on a high dose of an opiate and is not really giving them any relief around their pain, how exciting would it be for the patient when you say to them, did you know that this medicine you're taking is causing constipation as well? And then they might want to look at it. But what we tend to do is to go in and go, we've done this research and 9 out of 10 people on opiates don't benefit. And people don't want to hear that. Because common sense says if I'm taking a high dose of opiates and it's not helping my pain, I need more. And we can't work that out because we have the evidence and the clinical knowledge. But for the patient, it sounds stupid. When a high dose is not controlling my pain, I need more, not less of medicines, if you know what I mean.
It's a trope, isn't it, what matters to you? And it probably doesn't work asking people what matters to you. What you're describing is that you learn about what matters to them by having a conversation and building a relationship with them, which is fantastic.
Yeah, along those lines, Lelly, you mentioned the word listen several times. And so, you've mentioned that you're a coach practitioner.
Yes, I am. And actually, when we were talking about working with what's in front of you, so I did the coaching, executive coaching, career coaching and all that. I like that, but I wasn't too excited about that. And recently on the Looking After You 2 program, we've had to coach people because of the COVID. And it's exactly as you said. People turn up in the room and all hell breaks loose because it's about emotions. It's no longer about getting a band 7 or band 8A job. Is like things that matter much to people. It's about relationships. It's about how they're coping. It's about their resilience. And all the rules go out of the window and you just work with what you've got in front of you. And that's exactly what happens in a patient's home. You go in and you speculate about all the things that you could be doing, all the high risk drugs. But actually, when you meet the patient, they have a different thing on their agenda. And it's so important that we tap into that and coach it. But I like things about questions. I think the best thing about being a consultant or anybody who is knowledgeable or has experience, even just in life, is you learn to ask more questions than to give more answers. So, for example, when I go to a patient's house, you say to them, you're trying to stop the medicine. They go, I need my pain medicines. And so you take that and you don't argue with that because that's an assumption they've made. And I don't know, you guys, I think you put a book called Time to Think. And Nancy Klein talks about incisive questions. And so somebody goes, I need my painkillers. And maybe the question to ask is try to find out or try to hear from what they've said. Get them to articulate what it is they really need. It's not the painkillers they need. It's getting rid of the pain. That's what they need. Or more importantly, what would they like to do that the pain is not letting them do? So for example, I would like to go to Tesco and do my shopping without having to stop every 15 minutes. And so when you ask the incisive question, which is not focusing on the painkillers, then people might come up with a bit more option to help them to do what it is they want to do. And that way you have just something else other than just the painkillers. But it's no point arguing with people about the painkillers. You need to ask more questions to get them to think by themselves and to come to a solution or a number of solutions that you can then look through and decide what's probably best for the patient.
That's great, Lelly. One final question from me, Lelly. I agree with all that, and I can see the coaching coming through. I think this podcast is sponsored by some executive coaching. Anyway, I'll move on from that. Lelly, let me take you back to a younger version of yourself. Look, Lelly Oboh, 9th of September 2004. We mentioned it on the podcast a few episodes ago when we had Dr. Tessa Lewis, friend of the podcast, on. And there you are, keen as, typing away, getting your letter in. Do you remember it?
Yes, I do.
Is it on your CV?
I have it as a citation. But it was quite interesting because I was listening to that and that came right out of the blue. And I really remember typing away. And yes, I think that was the beginning of my career when I began to